We will present the last three topics of Unit 3. My classmates, Arturo, Isaac, and Josué. And we will focus on technology and L2 testing. So, introducing the articles which are Measuring Oral Proficiency in Distance, Face-to-Face, and Blended Classrooms by Blake, 2008. Validation of a web-based ESL test by Chapelle, Jamieson and Hegelheimer, 2003. And lastly, Language Testing and Technology Problems of Transition to a New Era by Dooey, 2008. So let's start with the objectives, which basically are the examination of the case of Spanish Without Walls, which is a course offered at the University of California, both hybrid and distance learning format, and the examination of oral proficiency through three types of first year Spanish courses, which are hybrid course, 2 days instruction per week, 7 hours of study via technology, a completely virtual distance learning course, and a control group of traditional classroom students. So as an introduction, distance learning may not be like the best means for learning for everyone. However, it may be best for people who work or who want to work independently. So what can be like another possible reason to study or to have a distance learning?
Well, first of all, I think that this article was very interesting because it's breaking the paradigm into oral proficiency. It's not like other studies that we have seen previously. This is focused into oral proficiency. Now you're thinking, oral proficiency, computer learning, how is that possible? And this was what I found interesting.
Okay. Well, and in that regards, I also see a difference in this, especially in this article, compared with the previous one, the previous piece that we did. I remember that on one of the articles that we discussed on the previous video, they had the concept of hybrid learning, but they were kind of using it. They didn't have like a very, very strong definition of what are they calling hybrid. It was more like a synonym for blended learning.
Blended learning.
Whereas in this article, they actually are telling you that they're calling it hybrid because it's just 2 days in classroom and the rest is on the computer or via the technology.
Online.
So there's a good distinction where they tell you it's hybrid because just part of the time it's 100% in the classroom and the rest is online. Whereas in blended, you have the combination of classroom and distance. I mean, it might sound as the same, but in practice it's different. And here they're making it clear what hybrid they are referring to.
Yes, and once again, they refer to people who already have occupations outside of school, so this is aimed towards them.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so we begin with the clear structure of well-defined research, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Concerning the methodology, actually Versant for Spanish was administered to 233 students enrolled in traditional classes, 85 in hybrid course, which is distance learning, all enrolled in the first 7 levels of Spanish instructions.
Mm-hmm.
It is important to mention that 15 heritage learners in a lower division traditional course took the test to see if Versant for Spanish was able to differentiate between advanced and home language learners. Basically, values were separated. For example, vocabulary, sentence mastery, pronunciation, fluency, etc. were separated. In here, my concerning or my question to you is, can you see what would be the disadvantage of focusing, for example, vocabulary, pronunciation, fluency, mastery? do you see a disadvantage, and what type of disadvantage can be?
Well, initially, I think that it opens up research for oral proficiency,
Yeah.
which hasn't been done, or there is very limited research concerning distance learning. So I think it's opening up that field a little bit more.
Yeah, and in regards with using this type of program or speech recognition system, and I would say that there is a disadvantage because, as the article said, this program or this speech recognition system had to be trained or was trained by experts.
Yeah.
So it means that whatever that was not in the program and the students produced, it was not recognized. And we know that speaking is not linear. Speaking is not only enclosed in certain lexis or in a certain syntax. The speaking goes all over the place, and we know by fact that speaking is not grammatically constructed.
Yeah.
Hence, if there is a program that was previously trained by the experts in order to focus in particular aspects of the language, and the student is not producing that, it's going to be evaluated as wrong. Maybe the student was able to transmit or to send a message, maybe not grammatically or whatever other appropriately, something that could be expected by the program, but communication was achieved. Nevertheless, the program is not looking for that. It's looking like for the use of grammar, use of vocabulary, very use of syntactic and very, very formulaic structures. Yeah. So that's something that I consider a disadvantage with this type of speech recognition.
I agree with you, because the way people actually interact, I mean, how doesn't necessarily have to be exactly how the system is expecting the users.
I mean, it's limited by how it was trained.
Okay.
It's very enclosed, and following up on what Josué mentioned, I think it encloses proficiency to certain aspects and doesn't take the whole of the language more into consideration.
Okay. Moving up to the discussions and the results. As probably we all suspect, is like not surprisingly, heritage learners outperform the non-heritage groups. So additionally, based on for Spanish, the Spanish results, distance learning, hybrid, and classroom counterparts have no significant differences with regard to oral proficiency. So what do you think this may happen? What can be the possible causes for this?
Well, I think initially the motivation that the distance learners have, because they consider certain objectives that are tied with their careers, with their professional field, or with what they are actually developing with outside of the school. And
I mean, if you see them looking at for that very, very perspective and thinking about distance learning, you might think that they would have a less chance to have developed certain language proficiency because they are not in an environment where negotiations for reading can happen and language proficiency can get better, etc. Yet, as Isaac mentioned, they have a very intrinsic motivation, which was, as far as I understood, the majority, if not all, they had a connection with their own studies and their own careers. So there was a big intrinsic motivation for them to improve their oral proficiency. And you might think, well, they're not in the classroom, they don't have a guide, they don't have a model to follow in terms of oral proficiency, but they have the motivation to do it by themselves.
And I think besides the interaction, it's very different between person to person. Like in the classroom, you have the teacher, you have other classmates, and maybe sometimes students could inhibit their oral production.
Probably time constraints, anxiety to perform in the classroom.
Yeah, we can see many more issues that could interfere with. And on this mode that you mentioned, their own motivation, I think it's a key element.
yes.
Okay. Basically, just to finish, specifically in your context, do you think that how would it be, or how would it work in terms of like results based on your perception? Would be like a similar results as presented on the article? What do you think, taking into consideration your
Well,
context?
now that you mentioned that, and if you personally ask me, one of the things that should be taken into consideration in the article, and maybe we'll discuss that in this shortcomings and strengths, is the fact of washback effect. I mean, this was for testing oral proficiency, and it was trained. And obviously the teachers, either in the distance learning or in the hybrid or in the classroom, were aiming to this oral proficiency test. So there's a problem, I would say, with negative washback.
Okay.
That's perhaps why the students got a good result.
Could be.
Because they were very, very focused on the things that the program was trained, and the students were able to produce that. Hence, they were able to have good results. If you've asked me in my own context, I don't know what the results would be, because I would not focus on how the program was trained. I would rather focus on what my students at the moment need.
Okay.
And that's a different story.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think personally, open up the scope of what oral proficiency is, and not limit it to certain aspects. Maybe open it up to a wider range of what oral proficiency may be.
Yeah. The objectives of this article basically is to provide information concerning the factors that affect decisions about the validation process within web-based tests, and also to illustrate the validity argument that results from the phases of validation processes. Real quick, talking about validation theory, with regard to what and how to validate, it is known that tools of validation actually require decisions related to the context in which the assessment takes place. So my question, my first question for you is, what can be validity?
I think that
No, I was just gonna mention perhaps to focus on how appropriate the interpretations are about
What is being
what is being evaluated.
and also I think how adequate the scores are of a given evaluation.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean it's like it's a combination of both. How appropriate and how adequate are the items in the test, and the results of those items will have like a real representation of what is being evaluated. I don't know if I made myself clear. I mean, all the items should have a connection with what the student is being evaluated, and then can be translated into something meaningful.
You know, I relate this information from the article to like actual test in ESL classroom perhaps. You know, you need to make sure that the tests are actually valid, because you cannot test a point that it's not it's not been taken into account. And I think this is what we're going towards in this article.
Okay.
I don't know.
Okay. Based on what you discussed already, consequently, could be my second question, which is with regard to the impact or consequence. Could you elaborate on different reasons of why we should consider like being critical
On the aspect of validity?
Yeah. Well, it's like I mentioned. I mean, if you're going to teach a specific point, you have to make sure that you're gonna test that specific point. Okay, because
which again falls into the washback effect.
Yes.
Positive washback effect in this case.
In this case, it's positive, not negative, like you mentioned. Yes, it would be positive, because if it doesn't matter if you have the student learn many different points. As long as you're testing all those different points, I think you're on the right track. But if you try to deviate, or if you find something that doesn't have nothing to do with what you're teaching, why are you testing that?
And also, I think something that should be taken into consideration is that everything that happens before the test should work, and including the test, should work as a well-oiled machine. I mean, the teacher, the program.
Okay.
The program, which is the base of what you teach, and then the teacher taking into consideration the program and using the program, and as Arturo mentioned, then the teacher teaching to the students what the program said.
Okay.
Yeah.
To have this connection, and at the end, of course, the test will be like what completes the system in order to have a well-oiled machine. I don't know what.
And operating with and between all the elements.
Yeah.
Okay. And moving on to the design of the test and participants. As reading the article, testing module interest and ability finder was used to what form of test to take, basically focused on general test or business. 47 participants for reading skills test, 49 for listening, and 50 on focusing on writing structures. Age between 16 and 45 years old. Participants recruited in and around Iowa State University. And ESL, EFL test was piloted in the same country. As also you noticed this, is that it may infer that there were not EFL learners due possibly to the location of the state, which is Iowa. So my question is, how piloting an EFL test may affect the results, or do you think it had an impact or concerning this specific issue?
I think piloting was a good decision. I mean, to actually see because we're talking about validity.
Yeah.
So I believe that there is a room for a great margin of error if you are not being very critical on some specific points. So I think they made a good choice on deciding to conduct the pilot.
Yes, I agree that piloting was important. However, the people who were recruited for this piloting phase, they may not be representative of EFL students or students whom this test was aimed for.
Yeah, I was thinking about the same, but also I was thinking that how the actual piloting affected the actual test.
Okay.
I mean, you already know what are the weaknesses of the people you were evaluating and what are the strengths. I mean, if the researchers, which is not mentioned here, did not make any significant change to the final test, I would say okay, just take into consideration that part of the individuals. But if they made a significant change to the final test, it's something like, what would you change the test in order to show better results or show a better picture than the real one?
Okay.
So that might also affect not only the people, but the test itself.
Okay. Okay.
Yes.
Moving on to the results, some different issues emerged. One of them was item difficulty. In here, it could sound coherent because the more difficult the test was, the lower the results of correct answers the participants obtained. Also, another issue was the classification of participants. Participants were divided into 3 proficiency levels on the basis of their score on all 72 items. 21 beginning level participants were defined with a score between 19 and 48. 8 of the participants took reading test, 11 listening, and other 11 participants the writing test. Also, the reliability of forms of the IAF, reading, listening, and writing structure test produced sufficiently high reliability for the beginning and intermediate levels. However, advanced level tests produced lower reliability. If you remember, some people mentioned, or some participants mentioned that they took the TOEFL exam. So do you think people who took the TOEFL affected their results, and how?
Well, I don't know if it would provide an advantage, perhaps, by the TOEFL exam. It's very specific, and you require certain skills.
Okay.
And I don't know how would that interfere actually with the other participants that did not take the TOEFL.
However, I think it's important to consider that the degree to which the TOEFL actually tests what it's aimed at testing, and if it doesn't fulfill that objective, I think then the scores may be unreliable, or they may not be seen as valid because it's questionable whether or not it tests what it's aimed to test.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that that will go more into the learner themselves, or whoever is taking the test. Because if you find a discrepancy between what the TOEFL said and what they all got into this IAF exam, and there's a big discrepancy, maybe the student the first thing the student gonna think is something is wrong here. Which one is wrong? Either this one, or either TOEFL or IAF, and that would affect the one thing, the reliability of both. And yes, of course, it can affect, but that depends on the student. How much attention he or she pays to the discrepancies or the similarities on both tests.
Okay. Just to finish, I don't know, something that caught my attention was, what about the speaking skill? Do you think, based on what we have discussed, do you think that part can be like a shortcoming of this article?
Well, as we mentioned in the previous article, speaking would be a little bit difficult to actually test. So I don't know about being accurate and valid on this other research. I think it's a bit difficult, yes.
And as I mentioned before, speaking is too broad. And what do you test? If it's language proficiency, in what area? How do you narrow it down?
It's more.
The objective is basically to examine a series of issues related to the design and application of computer-based tests with regard to validity. As we have mentioned, for example, in the previous article, we mentioned the TOEFL in this case. Concerning tests, who are two kinds, which are high stakes, for example, the TOEFL, low stakes test, for example, a test that cannot affect drastically the student's life. My first question is, what can be another type of high stakes test? Do you know, like, another type of test similar to TOEFL?
I mean, I think the TOEFL IBT is done through computers now, and that could be like an example. Or perhaps even the TKT test. Yes. That's
well, if we talk about this type of high stakes test, we can think of, if not all, on the majority of the Cambridge certifications exams. I mean, we have the certification of advanced English, we have the PET, we have the CET, and we have the TKT. And as mentioned in if I remember correctly, in the articles also mentioned the IELTS, which is part of the Cambridge certification system. And I think that these different types of exams have an impact, direct or indirectly, on the learners or in the students' lives. I mean, for example, for us, we were required to enter the masters to have a TOEFL degree, to have a certain level in the TOEFL.
Okay.
If we wouldn't have that level at the TOEFL, we wouldn't be accepted at the masters. So there's perhaps could be seen as that it would affect the life of whomever didn't have that grade.
Mm-hmm.
And in other examples, for example, the students who are studying a bachelor's degree here in Mexico, the majority of the recognized universities, no matter what degree you are studying, you are required to have a certain degree or a certain level in the TOEFL in order to obtain the degree.
Okay.
So there again, there is like an impact on the life of the students.
Mhm.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Moving to the research questions, which are: in what ways can computerized tests improve traditional test methods, and to what extent are the abilities tested on computer-based comparable to their pen and paper counterparts? Some of the language test characteristics are administered via computer, basically computer-assisted tests, the CATs. And the advantages of this is that the flexibility in administration. However, when I was reading the article, I could thought about some shortcomings of CATs. My question, like in your opinion, what can be some of the possible shortcomings of CATs?
Well, I think that more than a shortcoming in regards to this topic.
Let me interrupt you a little bit. I'm sorry. Specifically, like in the learner or the test taker's responses, do you see like a possible shortcoming, and what can that be?
On the responses.
Well, if we go back to the first article where there was this oral proficiency and it was
Okay.
trained to one type of result, it will be something similar in these CATs, because whenever you introduce a response in the computer, it's immediately checked and it's wrong or it's correct,
That's correct.
Yes. Which means that there are no room for open questions.
Okay.
It's most of the times it is like you have your multiple choice and you select the option, and then if you click on the correct, you have the correct.
Which at the same time, I think on the administrative part, it's an easier way to test large amount of students.
I mean, yes, of course, but the question was on the side of the actual exam takers,
Yeah.
which is the students, if we want to call them.
Yes, limiting the openness of the responses
Yeah.
to, as you mentioned, just multiple options, A, B, C, D. I think that's the main.
And I agree with what Arturo said. I mean, if you give on a computer-based exam, you as teacher, you get the results immediately.
You don't have to be going through every single question.
In the sense of administration, it is
Mhm.
easier.
Okay.
And I agree with that. But if we take on the student side, is you only have, out of the 4, you have only 1 correct.
But once again, what are you testing? Okay, if we go, like, if we're actually going towards multiple options, then that's fine. But if you are going towards open questions, then I think we have a problem here, definitely. Yes, I agree with you on that
Yes.
I mean, could be like practical for teachers, but what about the student? That could be something that to think a little bit about.
one. Okay.
And also another aspect that the article discusses or touches upon is the computer familiarity, the broader issues, which is, it is mentioned that it is important to be computer familiar in order to take this type of tests. And numbers are on the rise, are increasing when we talk about comfortability of taking computerized tests. However, others, as we have like discussed through the semester, technology may not be comfortable for some test takers. So what about your context? A little bit of discussion about your context. Very like specific. What about your context? Would it be possible to integrate computerized tests?
Well, in my particular context, the use, the access to computers is very limited. We don't have as many computers, and the ones that are available, the software is quite old and not very updated. So I think it would be difficult, but considering maybe mobile phones, SurveyMonkey, and anything else that may be reached from a smartphone, I think that would be an alternative to formal computerized testing.
I think you have touched a very important point because, I mean, are you restricting the students to be in the classroom and apply the test in the classroom? But of course, how are you going to check if they are being honest, if they are not getting like additional help from additional person? Like if, in the case if they decide to take the test on their cell phones at home, I mean, it would be difficult.
Yes.
So probably,
Yeah, taking into consideration what they both already have mentioned, another aspect that should be taken into account is the construct validity of the test itself. Because if you have Monkey Survey, if you have Google Forms, if you have whatever other tool to create this test, that would affect the construct validity of the test itself. So there's something to take before selecting what are you going to use. Take into consideration the construct validity of the test itself, and then you select the tool you're going to use.
and all these things you have mentioned made me think about like the possible conclusions, which is basically, I would say, CATs may improve pen and paper versions because of flexibility and all that type of practicalities for the teacher. However, it could only work in only certain specific circumstances, I don't know. And also, I perceive that it deserves further research in the sense of the skills. Skills need to be measured like very, so I don't know, that's how I would conclude with this article. And now, as a general conclusion, what can be some of the differences and similarities between the three articles?
I mean, it was obvious that the three articles were talking about testing and in different degrees and in different focusing in different
They
areas.
were connected, yes.
And also they were all were talking or making a distinction or making a comparison between what is happening on paper and what happens on computer and distance teaching and distance learning. And I don't know what else you were able to notice as a similarity.
Yeah, I think it's evaluation incorporating computer tools or computerized testing in the form of evaluation.
Yes, very.
Okay, and what about the strengths and shortcomings?
If I can mention a shortcoming for all of the articles, they were so high and they were so, if we want to call it, hyped on using technology, using computers to test. But something that none of them, if I remember correct, something that none of them mentioned was the problems that comes with using technology.
Okay.
I mean, if you have your test designed to be taken in using computers, what happens if there's a power outage?
I was just thinking that.
If it's online, what happens if the internet connection goes out?
It sounds ridiculous, but it's a reality.
But it is a reality, and it happens.
Yeah.
So those things, I would say that for all of the three articles, were not mentioned, were not taken into consideration. So that should be considered as a shortcoming for all of the three.
Yeah, because we're assuming that everything is gonna go perfect all the time.
As planned.
Okay.
Also, I think focusing mainly on the speaking skill and speaking proficiency. And what about the other skills? How may the other skills be implemented into computer-assisted evaluation? So I think they limit their focus to just oral proficiency.
Yes, we agree on that one.
What can you tell me about the strengths of the articles?
Well, I think that if we can, they have a positive view
Uh-huh.
and on regards with computer language or using computer or technology, sorry, to test in testing, and they provide you with a spectrum of possibilities to be used, and what are the different things you should take into consideration when using technology to test. I mean, that's a strength. That's something that I saw as a strength.
And I think the overall structure of each of the articles, they were very linear and very concrete concerning the aim that they had.
Besides raising awareness about these topics nowadays, that we're trying to include computer evaluations in the different skills, it's actually something that I think is gaining importance. It's taking more and more research, something that we didn't see before.
Yeah, it's providing a glimpse into this area of testing and using ICT in the classroom. And I would say that also the strength is that all of the articles were well written, were I would say well organized, and it's something that also is they were very easy to, I don't know for you, but it was very easy to read these articles.
Yes.
If we compare this to some of the articles we had at the beginning of the semester, it was like, oh my god, this is heavy. But these were kind of easy to read and easy to follow.
Yeah, we agree on that one.
And I would like to mention as the final thoughts that computerized testing may be positive and also it may contain some negative aspects with regard to the students or the test takers. However, it is taking quite an importance within EFL, ESL teaching, and also testing for diverse aspects like flexibility, practicity, etc. And definitely, I would say this deserves this area deserves further research, but very, very deep. So I would like to conclude with this discussion of the 3 articles.
Okay.